let's go back to these underlying drivers that are stressed in the transformative change assessment. What they really are saying is that we need to find ways to move from disconnection with nature and people to connection, from concentration of power to dispersed power, from concentration of wealth to reduced extremes of wealth and poverty, from short-term gain to long-term equitable prosperity, and from individual profit to societal for whole humanity good, and from material gains to something more beyond material gains, beyond material prosperity. So these shifts are really at the basis for what I'm going to talk about in the coming minutes. So we should remember that these are the things that governance need to address. And the kind of policies, public policies, have a particular role in that. I will focus more on that since we are in Brussels in the policy workshop. Governance systems are of course involving a lot of different actors. But I think I hope I will show to you that with this kind of focus on these shifts, we will actually adding our human power of imagination, we will be able to expand the portfolio of biodiversity policies immensely. Because if there's one thing that is clear, stated in the transformative change assessment, is that the current scope and what do they call it, depth of biodiversity policies is far too narrow, far too limited, and it's definitely not addressing the underlying drivers of the underlying causes of biodiversity loss. So let's have that in mind. We are trying here to stimulate our imagination of what the scope of public policies and other governance tools can look like to really address these drivers. And we're going to do that through these 4 characteristics of governance that transformative change assessment highlighted as important for a governance system that can truly support the navigation towards transformative change. And starting with the first one, which is inclusive governance. So here, inclusive is really about raising the bar for what we can imagine, what policies and other governance tool can look like that, for example, just highlighting a few of these shifts, these from left to right, that was in the previous slide, help people reconnect with nature, which in essence means to strengthen the relational values towards nature, implying things like sense of place and community, care, responsibility, and stewardship. So what kind of policies and governance tools can do this? Well, we can start with thinking about, very simply, I think connecting with nature, and I'm not an environmental psychologist or something, so this is, of course, from a different discipline, requires being in nature, having physical contact with nature. Just at least assume that simple assumption, right? So then it becomes raising questions such as, what can we do with policies, for very simply, to bring something green into living environments, also in urban environments. That is, of course, happening a lot. But it's also raising questions like, how can policy support children and youth from all cultural backgrounds being in vastly increasing numbers, joining the scouts and the field biologists, or whatever club brings them out of the cities and being exposed and immersed in somewhat wild. In Netherlands, we don't have much wild, it's all created nature, but in nature, to be able to have that physical sense and building that sense of place and connection, right? And this is, a policy program. This is something that I experienced as a 5-year-old in Sweden. It's called Skogsmulle, taking out 5-year-olds to the forest to learn about what the forest is and what you can do and all the creatures there. And it's still existing, I think. But it's so moving from that, we can think about, but what about doing this in a context of migration? Enormous movements of people from their place of birth, from rural to urban, but also across country borders for whatever reason, whether it is, for labor or as refugees. But what can policies do to welcome the new European citizens to connect to the new nature? How can we help new citizens connect with that new place, the species and ecosystems and landscapes that they are now in, right? Or what can we do in terms of policies that can help a generation of children who grow up behind their screens to connect with the soil below their feet? So there are all these spheres of policy that we can think about. But maybe raising the bar even further, it's not only about physical connection and being and sense of place, it's also, if you truly want to strengthen that relational values, which implies, if we look at the schematic, relational values is really where humans are part of nature, and it's a reciprocal relationship. It's not only about realizing that you're benefiting from the gifts of nature, but it's about giving back. It's about seeing humanity as actually being able to give nature things. So the regenerative practices, how can we design policies that help people truly be part of that, to give back? Whether it is through their own allotment or helping, rewilding projects or whatever. But that is a necessary part. It's a part of being human, to give back in a relationship. If you would have a one-sided relationship with our spouse, it'd be a slightly undesirable. Right? So that's a lot of things to discuss, and it's an easy bridge to the next characteristics of governance, the integrative governance. Because here, it's really about including as many types of people and views and perspectives in governance processes in that common affair of caring for nature, right? So that can be in everything from the environmental participation routes that the Aarhus Convention is laying the basis for the growing examples of citizen assemblies where the public can bring in their ideas to what kind of policy options we need, whether it's for climate or biodiversity. Or coming back to this, being able to open the avenues for practical engagement from all those who want to be physically involved in eco-agriculture or any other such practices. But it's also, of course, what we already heard about from Francisco, it's also about including all those sectors that are the most active in causing degeneration of nature. So how do we do that? So the transformative change assessment, they stress, oh, I forgot to slide this, right. So that will come, just a second. So the transformative change assessment stresses that various approaches to do this, to kind of bring in biodiversity perspectives in these sectors. You can use, for example, joint planning procedures, assigning legal responsibilities, developing practical solutions, forming collaborative structures, and designing co-evaluation processes. So there are all kinds of examples out there of few initiatives that have been able to pull this off in specific contexts. But what I want us to do then is to imagine what policies and other governance tools could look like that integrate goals of decentralizing power and dispersing wealth from the few to the many, in food and energy systems. If we would have that as a goal for policy making, what would that look like? And that could be, for example, to enable, and another example would be looking at the underlying drivers. How do we enable with policies to integrate beyond material motivations for nature protection, which are a strong motivation in some or many groups, depending on the context where you are in the continent, right? And it could be anything from, if you're going to disperse power in the food systems, how easy is it for farmers and other smallholder, small agriculture producers to actually directly sell to the consumers. So this is the farmer store in our village where we can go. Actually, it has the best service ever because it's 24 hours. Everyone who becomes a member gets a key. And you can go there at midnight if you forgot to buy milk. So it's like better than the normal supermarket. Or for example, the UNEP efforts to both enable and document how faith-based organizations are restoring nature. So in a European context, what kind of policies could enable people of different faiths in their homes, in churches, synagogues, and mosques, to actually enact on that nature stewardship that is part of their faith. So, inclusive and integrative governance, you already hear it's a lot about many different actors being involved, and we're talking about governance systems, and we're talking about how there are so many actors that need to be involved that traditionally haven't been involved in nature policy and governance efforts. And part of that conversation then moves over to accountable governance in such complex systems, consisting a lot of networks. In the transformative change assessment, it's then very strong emphasized that if you have this kind of network-based governance with a lot of actors, one of the things that all actors need to be actively doing in such context is to build trust. And generate trust and social capital among each other. And of course, there are many ways to build trust. But one of the ways in our governance systems that we tend to use is to somehow develop accountability frameworks. We expect them to ensure more trustworthy behavior, that there's more coherence between promises and actions. So, of course, trustworthy behavior is a fundamental part if we're going to have trust among each other. And the assessment lays out that we need an accountability system that clearly assigns responsibilities and timeframes, that provides complementary institutional mandates, that iteratively and transparently evaluates and revises policy regulations. But how can we do this effectively when those how can we do this at all these levels that we need to engage with? For all these actors, and particularly, how can we do this, including for those actors that either ignore or actively resist nature concerns in our various contexts? Hearing Paul's presentation about all the policies being framed as rewarding positive and behavior, carefully avoiding shaming anyone. Now, accountability systems can certainly have positive rewards as an outcome, but we don't tend to assume that that's the only outcomes of accountability systems. We tend to assume that effective accountability systems can also point out and hold someone to account when they're not doing what they're supposed to do. They're not doing enough, right? So, but now coming back to the background of what we're trying to do here, to have governance that shifts that addresses these underlying drivers, these really hard things. How can we then assign responsibilities? We have to imagine, how can we do this? Oh yeah, that I already said, for those who distract. But how can we assign clear responsibilities for example, for something like reconnecting people with nature, when it is such a deeply personal and social process? How can we do so for dispersing power in production and consumption system, where the very notion of a system is countless actors, countless interconnections, overlapping responsibilities, positive redundancies, maybe also negative ones, And uncertainty in cause-effect relations, of course. We don't understand all of these systems. They're unpredictable. So how can we assign clear responsibilities and timeframes in a system context? And how can we make evaluation of actions then also serve not only more trustworthy behavior, but also all those things that we don't know yet to learning, right? Because if you look at governance accountability systems for complex problems, you cannot do the old-fashioned, you have responsibility to achieve this and you'll be rewarded or punished if you don't achieve this, because the interconnections are so much more complex. You need to, so scholars have suggested you need to develop notions of shared accountability, not least legal formal accountability. You need to have dynamic accountability, which is accountability systems explicitly designed for learning, that learning is an outcome, right? And in TRANSPATH, we are trying to figure out how we can support stakeholders in very diverse contexts to engage in this kind of iterative processes of evaluation and to actually build what scholars have referred to as this capacity of ecological reflexivity. So how can you engage in a regular process with recognizing what your impact is on the socio-ecological system, make that lead to deep reflections over your underlying values, and channel that into a response, of course, in mostly required changed actions. So we're exploring how we can anchor such dialogues in stakeholders in different contexts in this safe and just operating concepts without coming over as elitist and kind of top-down dictating, of values that are not connected to the life worlds of where people are. So, rounding off, we have talked about these 4 characteristics of governance systems needing to address the underlying drivers. If we put them together, I forgot the adapt. Yeah, I was talking about adaptive governance without showing you the slides. So here we talk about support creative learning processes for reframing problems and breakthrough path dependencies. And so this is where I was talking about reflexivity, to create these planning processes of monitoring evaluation, which the transformative change assessment raises, to continually reflect on the actions, responsibilities, and underlying drivers. And indeed, so connecting together, and the adaptive governance characteristics is really what connects these governance characteristics together, because no one has the answer of what we need to do in a particular moment along these transformative pathways. And therefore, this capacity of reflection and adjusting course is so essential. So then finally coming to connecting all the 4 characteristics together, I hope I have been able to see that there are connections between all of them. And if we bind them together, there's a lot of promises in what the synergies between these 4 and addressing them all together can give. But it also raises of course, new questions when we put these together, because it raises the questions of what are the transformative capacities that we need to train and build and learn in this process. And it raises the question also, where do we draw the boundaries for the inclusive, integrative, adaptive, and accountable governance characteristics? Can there be too much of any of them?